following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
Services like the graph that provide indexing and querying at scale in a decentralized way. So a lot of these services and platforms and tools in the ecosystem are going to be fundamental.
We're like astronauts floating in the space of time. Lost between the past and future.
Welcome to the GRTIQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Vijay Sundaram, co-founder and CEO at Luda, a company that creates playful projects and protocols for emergent entertainment. During this interview, you're going to hear the story of an entrepreneurial venture that could only exist inside Web3 and holds the potential to disrupt the media and entertainment industry. Vijay and I discuss his background, including time at Microsoft and Google, and his entrepreneurial journey into Web3, which includes launching a decentralized search engine in 2009. Then we shift our attention to Luda, Wonder Protocol, and Neo Fairies. And as you're about to hear, this story could only happen in Web3 and clearly articulates what happens when innovative talent meets DAOs, NFTs, and protocols. We began the conversation by talking about Vijay's educational background.
I majored in computer science and minored in economics at Columbia University. Very much an engineer at heart. I still kind of sneak in as much time as I can to write and commit code through all the jobs I've had. I ended up majoring in computer science in somewhat of an unexpected turn of events because I'd spent most of my youth being groomed to be a doctor. And just before college started, I kind of had one of these moments of waking up and being like, why am I going to be a doctor? And it's because, my mom's a doctor and that's what everyone talks about being. And so I did the most logical thing, which is reject that idea, not know what to do next, and then see what my dad does. And it turns out my dad was a software engineer. And so then I started to actually go investigate what it meant to be a software engineer. I found a book on coding and made my first C program. And that moment, there was a magic that just won me forever, which is the ability to kind of open up this blank digital page, type a bunch of stuff into that page, hit compile, run, and the thing comes alive. And then if you decide you don't want it, you just delete it. And, you don't have to crump it up and throw away in a waste basket. You're not polluting the earth. You literally just start all over again. And that sort of magic just was irresistible and kind of set me down a path that I've now been on.
I'm always intrigued by computer science. There's been a bunch of guests on the podcast that have that educational background, but I still don't fully understand what a degree in computer science actually means. How would you help listeners understand that?
So it's a really good question. My sense is computer science programs vary quite broadly depending on where you went and when you went to school. My program there was a combination of, I'd say, theory and practice, a really nice balance, which meant you learn some kind of first principles about how computer works, what is computing, how did, the nuts and bolts of programs get built. And then we had a heavy dose of hands-on application areas where you're actually programming in different languages, learning about how different languages have different trade-offs, building different components of systems. And so I think that was very much kind of a nice quality of at least my program at the time I went, which was back in 2000 to 2004.
So back in 2000, 2004, when you're studying these things, is there even a whisper of blockchain or crypto or anything like that in the environment of what you're studying?
No, not really. But I'll say the closest thing was peer-to-peer technology. So I was in college right at the time. Napster really kind of hit consciousness, at least for me. It was central to my experience. And part of the program in particular that I went to was a systems level track. And so systems level computer science work really gets you to the core of building blocks like operating systems and storage and networking. And so a lot of the things that peer-to-peer software kind of made tangible and real and valuable, kind of built on directly on those primitives and gave way to the blockchain.
So after you graduate, you make your way into the professional world and start developing your career, and you land, I suppose, right at Microsoft. Have I got that right?
Yeah. So I ended up joining Microsoft right out of school and really kind of jumped out of my technical undergraduate program and wanted to get exposed to the business side of the world and kind of understand a bit more about how the other half of the profession I had never been exposed to during school work. Microsoft at the time was one of the most impressive companies in the ecosystem and had figures and everything. So it was a way to get a really wide perspective on everything happening in the technology industry.
If you could sum up maybe one or two key learnings you had while working at, one of the premier companies on the planet, right? Microsoft is one of the biggest and most successful companies on the planet. What are some of the learnings or things that you observed there that you still think about?
Probably for me, my experience at Microsoft, both I spent some time as a PM of a product called OneNote, which is kind of this delightful new product at the time that I still love. Some people hate it, they're polarizing, but that's what new categories are like. And then at Microsoft, the other role I had was in the corporate strategy group at Microsoft. And I think in both of those cases, Microsoft was just so ambitious in wanting to move into different areas, different markets, different technology domains. And so it was a really valuable place for me as a new graduate to kind of get exposed to what is it like to create new categories and break into new categories, and really kind of quite molded my brain around this idea of, where's the world going? Where are the opportunities? And how do you build kind of very intentionally into those things?
So after your time at Microsoft, you jumped around from startups and different things. What can you share about that experience and the path that you took to where you are presently?
Overall, I've now spent close to 2 decades in the technology industry, which is mind-blowing for me personally, reflecting on it. But I've definitely been all over the place, from big companies to founding startups, and as an operator and as an investor. And so I'm a bit of a mutt in that way. I'd say my through line that's been fairly consistent in that whole journey has been designing, developing new products, thinking about new experiences that can really only be possible if you're using new deep technologies at the core of those things. Definitely the funny thing about my journey was it started at big company, transitioned to small startup land where I founded my first startup, worked on another startup and with other startups as an investment operator, and then kind of ended back up in big company land with Google. But that's a fun story for how I got there.
Well, let's talk about that. How did you go from big company to startups to big company, moving from Microsoft to now Google?
Okay, so after Microsoft, I started a new company with a colleague of mine that was a search engine, a decentralized search engine. That was my first real started, end up raising money from investors and going through kind of the classic arc of building a first product, shipping it, having some early success, being acquired by another company, and then leaving the company that acquired us. I'd actually kind of gone through a bit more of a full-on Silicon Valley, explore everything I can in terms of what's happening, in terms of new technologies, new projects, tinkering on my own personal projects. End up eventually starting a second company, which never made it out of the garage, which was a consumer robotics company that no one's ever heard of. But we did some really kind of fun, playful things using IoT and AI and ML and using these technologies to give people kind of a moment of joy from this physical embodied robot, and didn't really take it much past the tinkering phase, but it was a good lesson in kind of what became something I found as a personal purpose a little bit later in my career. What ended up happening at that point was kind of like most people, I think, just fell into venture capital and investing. Met some folks at an event. They liked my background. I was personally very interested in being a little bit more enmeshed in what was happening with machine learning and robotics, and being involved in helping other startup founders and working across companies as opposed to just building my own from scratch. And that experience in venture capital took me kind of into this own personal journey investing as an angel investor. And so for the course of about 2 to 3 years, I'd spent most of my energy and time spending time on kind of the other side of the table from startups. having worked on the other side of the table with founders and really been involved in seeing where different parts of machine learning and robotics and new technologies like crypto are going, I got my own sense of personal inspiration. It was really the first time, I'd say in my life, that I'd kind of gotten my own sense of purpose that was really, really deep and not just about, this new technology to go after or this new market opportunity. And that was really about how do you use these new technologies, how do you use things like machine learning and crypto and mixed reality to create moments of joy and play and wonder and delight for people. And it really hadn't kind of connected in my brain up until that point that there's this massive world of entertainment, of games, of storytelling, where that is the job, right? The job is to bring those moments of play and joy and wonder to people. And that's the only job. And me coming from Silicon Valley and deep tech have, very little to offer in the way of experience in that industry, but have these resources to do things that can sometimes create magic that, people have never seen before. And that felt to me like a really, really important place to spend my time on Earth. And that's kind of what led me into Google, where a new team was getting started in Google Research. Team's role was very much around looking at ways to use the bleeding edge and state-of-the-art of machine learning in new ways. And I ended up starting an R&D program there for interactive entertainment, which is kind of what led me into Google for about 3 years before I left to start Luda.
Well, I'm going to talk to you a lot more about founding Luda and everything that's going on there. But before I do, I want to ask a couple follow-up questions. The first one being, I'm always surprised when I interview individuals like yourself who go through this interesting dichotomy of working at a large company and some of the benefits and advantage of that. I got to imagine there's security, there's a check that's coming every 2 weeks. I mean, all those types of things. And then venturing off into starting your own things and being an entrepreneur. So what is it for you that drove you from kind of the security of working at a very large company like Microsoft to going out and doing something on your own?
For me, the early days in my career were a slightly different answer than, later days here. Because now I've kind of done this twice coming out of a huge company, which I hadn't really even thought about. But first time around, I think it was a little bit more academic in the sense that I wasn't at Microsoft for all the reasons you talked about. It was a great brand to have on your resume. It was a place to learn about how the industry works, all these check boxes that you do as you're trying to build your way in your career. And then leading to start a company came from a place of genuine personal passion for what we were doing. Leading Microsoft to start Found Software, which is the first startup, was a bit more intellectual in its nature. I had been very excited about and passionate about the problem we were solving, but I was also excited to try something with no constraints and have a blank page and build a new product from scratch and build a team. Second time, or let's say the third time, I guess technically, now leaving Google to start Luda, it really came from a completely different place of personal purpose and a thing that you want to see happen in the world and the kind of place and people you want to work around, and realizing after spending, 15 years that you can't find that sometimes, right? The only way to get that is by creating your own environment. If it was easy enough to find a company where I can just do what I'm doing with the people I want to do it with and the way I want to do it, it's much easier and much more fun in some ways to not have to be the founder as CEO and take on all the existential angst of doing this. But it is a lot easier for me in some ways this time around than it was the first time around to make this decision, because you don't see any other way to do the thing needs doing, and you want to see done in the way you want to see it done. And so that made it a lot easier than I think it would traditionally. The other thing is my path back into Google really did come a bit as an unexpected turn. And the reason I was at Google was less about being at a big company and having the comfort of resources and all things that come with it. It was much more about a place and a way to work on something I'd found really personally inspiring. Right? And there are a few places on the planet where I could actually exercise some of these ideas I shared earlier about wanting to use these state-of-the-art technologies and build these new moments of play and joy and wonder for people. At that time, in 2018, it was just a place and a way to exercise that passion as opposed to, maybe the reasons I started at Microsoft in the first time around.
The GRTIQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTIQ. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Every download is a vote of support and helps drive the podcast forward. I want to especially thank those of you who've taken the time to leave a review, give a 5-star rating, or share your favorite episode on social media. Each week, the GRTIQ podcast shines a light on the people working to build Web3 in the graph, with the hope that hearing their stories and perspectives will help you as you make your own journey. If you have the ambition to make a contribution to the graph or Web3, then you should take the next steps and get involved. You can join the graph community on Discord, Reddit, the forum, and on Telegram. You can also explore becoming a graph advocate, joining the Graph Advocates DAO, or the new Subgraph DAO. You can find links to these opportunities in the show notes. Thanks for listening. Well, another theme that's developing more and more as I speak with people on this podcast is this entrepreneurial journey, something you've referenced yourself. And I'd like to ask you if you could give advice to anybody listening to this podcast that wants to be an entrepreneur. Maybe they want to do startups. Maybe they like this idea of angel investing. I mean, all the different things that you've been working on. What have you learned about being an entrepreneur that you think you could share with others exploring the possibility of?
Starting a company is very idiosyncratic thing. It's hard, I think, for any one person's advice to be the advice anyone should have. So I always hesitate to be able to assertive about it. But I do think finding a sense of purpose in what you're doing is such an important centering to starting something, because invariably you're in this role, you're in this company, things are hard, and not having kind of that deep well of a why and a purpose to drive what you're doing there can really make, what is actually like a pretty hard, irrational, impossible effort even harder. And so I did see a lot of folks, and I often ask folks when they're going into it, what their real sense of purpose and is for it, because it's a good fact check, on whether you really can't do what you're doing somewhere else or in some other way.
So we're going to now turn our attention to Luda. And I think like the takeoff point, the pivot question here I want to ask you is about crypto and when you first became aware of it. You're a traditional guy working in tech. You've worked at Microsoft. You've worked at Google. And then at some point, I imagine crypto gets on your radar and you have some original impressions and some ideas. Take us back in time to that point and what you were thinking.
Funny enough, before crypto hit my radar, I was long on decentralization. So we talked a little bit about this earlier, but the first startup in 2009 that I co-founded was a decentralized search engine for personal data. And at the time, the thing that motivated it was looking at Web 2.0 services like files and photo sharing and messaging. And what was bizarre about that era was you do things like take a photo on your phone, you'd upload that photo to someone else's server, and then you're going to pay that service to get that photo sent back to you or to share that photo with your friend, right? And when you see the world from that lens, it's kind of hard to unsee it. Here we are creating all this content and data and essentially handing it over only to get it back from, the places that we're putting it in. So the premise behind our company was to take the world of personal services that people would use and to create infrastructure to essentially cache and index people's data on local machines, which actually has a fun spiritual kind of connection to the graph, and then serve those indexes back to the consumers of that data and eventually to their friends and networks in a fully decentralized serverless way. So when Bitcoin hit our radar a couple years later, around 2011, 2012, it was a bit like love at first sight, because now it recognized this, in my mind, as what we were trying to do, but for money, right? And then you start to think about it, and you're like, oh, money has a lot of these same properties, like you earn your money, you put it into a bank. Now you're looking at it on a screen with some digital representation of how much is there. And then you're trying to pay this bank to give your money back to you, or wait for them to give you permission to get your money back. And you're like, this makes no sense. And a Bitcoin to me at the moment was like this for money. And you can now have digital cash under your mattress. And it's not about making money per se. It's just about control and ownership of the money you have. And then, you just see this play out over and over again, where Ethereum hit my radar. You could see that this was this for computing and application development. Then again, a few years later, 2017, CryptoKitties really kind of opened up how NFTs and creative, playful kind of content could also become things that you own. And so it's just very I was lucky, I guess, to have had that seed to then recognize the filter over and over again. And then maybe, a bit of psychoanalysis for myself, but something about control and power and freedom for yourself as an individual, I think really maybe was a through line here that was hard to resist.
I have to ask the follow-up question. You bring up the graph there, and you've mentioned that you started this decentralized search engine in 2009. What happened with it? The project, I believe, lasted for 3 or so years. What happened there?
So the company itself was acquired. It was a strong team, strong technology, great product, but we had not found growth and traction in a way that was, supportive of consumer runaway success. We hadn't had a business model yet, though we were looking at some things that I think would have been obvious ways to monetize in the enterprise with a enterprise or work search offering. But at the core, whether or not we could have built a better search engine that monetized better in the enterprise, you have this problem. And we were very conscious of this problem going in, which is building platforms and infrastructure, building a decentralized storage system for personal data is not something a consumer is going to relate to or care about, right? We need to build some experience that really makes that useful and personal to them and pull that through. And that's where the search engine layer that we talked about came from. That was really the end user product experience. But the underlying system of having decentralized nodes that store and cache your personal data and start to pull data back in some ways is like a much more spiritually aligned story with the blockchain, right? And we haven't had necessarily the conviction at that point to say, let's just actually talk about this story. And we did not have the insight to create synthetic currencies that could actually help bootstrap the system and create a self-sustaining business model that now allows, miners the incentives to manage transactions. So there's a bunch of these things that are, I think, just between both the concept and like the execution. We obviously, as we joke, we were a Satoshi Nakamoto short of $1 trillion outcome. But again, paid off so many dividends in terms of just priming our brain for where the world ought to be and being able to recognize it when it came around.
One last question on this product. You had a vision in 2009 centered on decentralization and data. You've kind of foresaw maybe a Web3 world without really knowing what it would be and what it was. Why is that important? Why in 2009 all the way to present are people like yourself in 2009 and people presently like the graph trying to solve for this? Why is it so important?
I want to answer this in so many different ways. I mean, there's a part of this I'll speak for myself and maybe you can project onto others in this ecosystem where you do have a sense for what's right, maybe. I don't want to get too righteous about it, but I think there's a value system there that's almost kind of like a ever-present truth. Like it's not like it wasn't true even 10 years prior, and it won't be true 10 years from now. But there are definitely these aspirations that maybe there's some new building blocks that give us a way to do this, right? Or there's some new experiences that help people understand and adopt this sort of approach. And so I think the world takes a long time and a lot of reps on having this aspiration and a vision that the underlying technology or business models or social contexts just aren't ready for. And so in that sense, it could feel like, we've been working on this since 2009, but in some ways, if you go back and look at some really incredible projects, back to peer-to-peer days and Napster and things like Plan 9 are these incredible research projects that were looking at how do you push the edges of peer-to-peer computing. And then, of course, you go back and look at all the incredible work that even predates, that around digital cash and peer-to-peer money. And so you can just kind of see that there's a sense that's much larger than any particular technology wave about the way things maybe ought to be. And now we're just kind of constantly trying new flavors and permutations of the building blocks that get us there.
So let's turn our attention now to Luda. You've mentioned it a couple times. It was the next step you took professionally after Google, but as you've told your personal story, we've kind of built all the way to the fact that you founded Luda because of some personal purpose and some things that you probably saw in the world that were missing. So let's start with just a basic question of what is Luda and what is the mission and vision for it?
Well, maybe I'll just take you through just a bit of how this emerged from my time at Google. So as I mentioned, I was there to start a R&D program around interactive entertainment. The idea there was to co-develop new forms of storytelling, new forms of gameplay mechanics, new types of creative tools alongside state-of-the-art deep learning technologies, which even now today still continue to have shocking progress in shorter and shorter periods of time. That experience was a place where I got to see for the first time, this idea I had in my head about how to use deep technologies for creating new moments of play and wonder and joy. And I keep repeating those things, but it's so it's the juxtaposition of those things are just so hard to find. And it was one of the most special times for me in my career to kind of live that out, not just kind of think about it academically in my head or invest in it as a VC. And so in that process, I also had a chance to meet my co-founder, Shannon Sudstill. She's in a way a mirror of my story. She spent most of her career in gaming. She co-founded Sony Santa Monica Studios, started the God of War franchise, among other things. And so she'd come to Google with the very same aspiration to use new technologies to really push the field of play and what we could do. And so she and I are attached at the hip. We spent a bunch of time working on a range of projects together. And one or two things really hit us like a ton of bricks. One was this sense of purpose that we could articulate as lifting people through play. Really became kind of like the starting point for what now is Luda. And the spirit of this was that if you take this human motivation of play, which is this wonderful thing, it's not necessarily about games, it's about what's kind of in all of us in the word play. And you're able to harness that motivation in a way that gives people the ability to be better off or to lead them better than before they were. And those two kind of concepts kind of bring together in some ways what the entertainment industry does incredibly well and what Silicon Valley does incredibly well, with wanting to make the world a better place and really pushing for life-changing, technologies and products. So if we could bring those two together, right, we can actually use the superpowers that both of these worlds have, whether you want to talk about it as Silicon Valley and Hollywood, or you want to talk about it as deep technologies and high entertainment. You create something that really doesn't exist on this planet and actually has incredible amounts of impact on the world. And that's very much like I'd say the deepest seed and root for what Luda is. That also kind of involves some things that are to us super important, which is that you want to bring a certain type of people and DNA and culture together that you just can't find other places, because you have the same dynamic we talked about play out in reverse in most of the industry. For a lot of entertainment, deep technical investment is a scary thing. And for a lot of technology companies, deep creative investment is not valued or also scary in its own way. And so you have this sort of tension where you can't quite get both together, really melding, but that's kind of what it takes, right? It's what it takes to actually get these magical outcomes, is to have incredibly talented, creative folks sitting shoulder to shoulder with deeply technical engineers and have folks kind of mind melding. And so that chemistry, that brew, that DNA is kind of what fundamentally makes what I think we're doing here, and why I look at this as a 100-year plus company and institution, not just a thing we're doing because of ML or a thing because we're doing because of crypto. But then the other thing, to get a little bit more back down to earth, is a bunch of the work that Shan and I have been doing centered on this idea of using machine learning and state of the art to create creative tools that players could use to make magical things. And the thing about machine learning is very powerful now. We're seeing this in all kinds of parts of the ecosystem. It's incredible as a creative tool that people can use to make things that make themselves look amazing, feel amazing, that make them, that give them expressive superpowers. And so we were building a bunch of concepts for open worlds and sandbox games where machine learning based creative tools would give players these creative, expressive superpowers. And then by virtue of creating and contributing to these open world sandbox games, the players would be part of helping build and grow them, right? And you could think about projects like Minecraft and Roblox all being very inspirational in this way. What kind of tipped us into leaving to start Luda was then putting this together with what was happening with NFTs and DAOs. And this is now kind of fall 2020 going into 2021. We started to realize that now we got these building blocks, not just to give players and fans tools to create amazing content, right? But now they can own the things they're creating, right? Now they can actually have a voice in where these franchises and platforms go, right? As opposed to just being a consumer of them. And so then, for me personally, it was this mind-blowing moment of we can now do for entertainment all the things we saw play out over again for money, for application development, for media. So there is kind of this amazing opportunity to kind of take the same value system that, we all know we're working towards and then bring it to this ecosystem of entertainment, interactive entertainment. And so that's kind of the tip off point for Luda.
So to make it real simple for listeners that maybe didn't catch all of that, in the most simplistic sense, Luda is marrying machine learning and kind of state-of-the-art technologies for creators and somehow bridging their ability to not only build, but own the type of content or experiences that they create. Is that a good summary?
The only subtle point I make is those tools are meant for consumers, for everyday users to be creative. That's actually the amazing thing about what we can do with machine learning is we can actually reduce the gap so that any user, consumer, through a playful tool can actually have the impact that you would otherwise maybe have had to be a capital C creator to do.
I want to follow this machine learning a little bit. So when I've heard of or encountered machine learning, it's always been in the sense of like technology and artificial intelligence, but you're talking about machine learning in this context of play and exploration. Connect the dots here. How does machine learning help here?
Okay, so there's probably two sides to this. One is, how does machine learning actually play into creative outputs? And so there are all kinds of models that have been developed either for different reasons or for expressly purposes of being creative, where you can use them as a user to produce outputs, to generate outputs. So you can see now all over Twitter feeds these days some incredible work from a project called Midjourney, where you're able to give a system a prompt, and that system is able to generate an image in high quality, high fidelity that matches that prompt. And sometimes results are uncanny. Sometimes the results are incredible and impressive. Sometimes they're hilarious. But whatever it is, the player, in this case, the user, the creative tool user, is able to have a lot of leverage in what they're generating, right? They're providing a few words of text that come from their imagination, and they get this incredible output, and they can try lots of things so they have something they think is something they're proud of and want to share. That exact loop that we're talking about is very, very similar to what happens in all of these sandbox games and open worlds, right? Where players come in, take Minecraft, they come in, they start mining, they start crafting, they build a structure, they have something they find personally meaningful or something they're proud of, they share it, goes viral. So that core idea of you make a thing, you're proud of the thing you made, has personal value to you, and then potentially it has some social and cultural value to other people. That loop doesn't change in terms of what makes a sandbox game a great sandbox game, or what makes a open story world a great story world. But machine learning is really just kind of the superpower that you introduce into the mix, so that instead of having to actually author the content you're trying to create from scratch, you're able to get this massive leverage. You can you get a few words and you get a incredibly high fidelity visual out. And so part of what we're doing is thinking about new kinds of content that aren't just about ownership and community. We're thinking about new kinds of franchises where tools allow players of all abilities without creative expertise to really contribute incredibly powerful storylines and characters and settings, in addition to obviously giving those players ownership over those things they created and a voice in kind of those platforms and franchises.
So what specifically then is the problem that Luda is trying to solve in the world?
The short answer is putting people at the center of entertainment. And I guess the longer answer that's a lot more interesting is kind of stepping back and saying, if you think about traditional entertainment and you think about what the world calls IPs, we're talking about things like Marvel or Minecraft. These are all projects that really put the intellectual property at the center, and the people who make that property, the fans, the players, the creators, on the outside. And if you think about that, kind of like the things we were talking about earlier, it feels backwards, right? The people ought to be at the center of these things, right? The fans and the players and the creators who imbue so much meaning into, the characters and the worlds and the games. And so this then gets this question, okay, what does it mean to put people back at the center? And it's not just that they get to participate economically and they get ownership, which is obviously very core to the Web3 ethos, but it's also they now have permission and in some ways incentives to care about and contribute creatively, right? Where they can actually build on and extend and mod and fork these game worlds and story worlds that they're in, the entertainment they're in. And you contrast that with what happens when you do that to traditional IPs. You get takedown notices, right? You get litigated. And so the contrast here is not just about putting people at the center economically, but it's also putting at the center creatively. And then, maybe at an even deeper level, you can actually think about this as socially centering people, right? If you want stories and games where the entire world can enjoy, then the people that are creating and owning these ought to represent the richness and diversity of the world as well, right? So this is really kind of the core of what we believe in, what we're trying to do. Now, a nice thing is when you look at the entertainment industry as a whole, it's actually been on this arc that's gone from the studios and the companies to putting more and more power in the hands of players, right? And so you can go through this arc of entertainment from read-only entertainment like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And you can look at where we've been more recently with read-write entertainment, really being these UGC platforms like Minecraft and Roblox, where the players aren't just consuming the content that's being created, they're contributing to it and sharing it with others. And we're really kind of trying to help with this next shift, which is going from UGC to UOC, user-owned entertainment, right? This is really what kind of ties together what you could look at as a read-write-own era of entertainment.
That's incredible, Vijay. So what I hear you saying, in essence, is that if you follow the story arc of entertainment and creators participating in the world, what you're trying to do at Luda is not only empower creators to kind of create in new ways, but also participate in from the perspective of ownership, that this is this evolution where it's the power is shifting, the center of power is shifting back to creators. I mean, if I got that right?
Yes, totally. The only thing I would caveat is, in this case, the other thing that's happening is that the gap between being a creator in a traditional sense of having a, high bar of creative expertise and needing to be proficient in tools is narrowing as well, right? I mean, if you look at the transition from being a creator for the Marvel Cinematic Universe to being a creator in Minecraft, the creator in Minecraft has a fairly accessible, playful entry point. Anyone can grab a controller and or tapping the keyboard, and you can kind of build in Minecraft without having to be, creatively, artistically fluent. And that's actually the other side of this trend, is the gap between creators and consumers closed. More and more consumers can express themselves in these environments. And of course, the things they create, they should own. There'll always be higher bar creator that enters these environments, and you want to also serve them so they can create incredible things for consumers. But there's a bit of a blurring there that is a fun part of the arc that entertainment's been on as well.
So in my preparation for this interview and doing a little bit of reading here, there's more to this ecosystem and what you're building than just Luda. There's other entities involved in this. There's Wonder Protocol, Solana, of course, and also there is Neo Fairies. So how can you provide some context for these participants in this ecosystem?
Okay, so Wonder Protocol is really a protocol to power create to own projects using these new building blocks like NFTs and DAOs. So the core idea behind create to own is that by contributing to a collective effort, in this case, a collective entertainment effort, you gain ownership through NFTs and IP rights and participate in governance through DAOs. Create to own is how the shift we described earlier from UGC, user-generated content, to UOC, user-owned content, and user-owned entertainment happens, where people aren't just creating and contributing to cinematic universes and sandbox games, but they're also owning and helping govern them as well. And so if you think about this from a creator point of view, your creator wants to create entertainment in this new category. You want to start a create to own project, and you want to be serious about it, right? Not just give it lip service, and really show your community that you want them to be part of co-creating and co-owning it with you. First thing is you need a DAO. There's all the basics of what you get with a DAO, and that's fine. There's plenty of ways to do that in the ecosystem. But then you also want a clear legal relationship with respect to the IP rights for what you're creating. And you want to have that be clear with your community and your users. You want your community to be able to create NFTs and contribute themselves, as opposed to having you as a creator just create and mint a bunch of them and sell them to your community. Right? And that actually has all kinds of implications for how exactly minting works. And one of the key things here is to be able to mint what a user creates on demand, which is a bit of a shift from how traditional kind of PFP projects work. Now you want the user's NFT that they created to also make them a member in the DAO that you created, right? To give them governance rights. And then finally, you kind of want the experience for that user of governance to not feel like they're managing a treasury or working a job, right? This should be about actually contributing to the creative development and the product roadmap and the future of the franchise they're contributing to. And so that kind of in total is what Wonder as a platform protocol is really supporting. Luda is a core contributor to that project.
And then how about Neo Fairies? How does it fit into all this?
So Neo Fairies is a DAO on Wonder. It is Luda's first project in starting a decentralized entertainment franchise that's really designed from the beginning to be co-created and owned and governed by the community. We think about this a bit like the iPhone launch, where Google Maps on the iPhone was this mind-blowing moment, because you could see that you could fundamentally rethink what a mapping app is once you have it on a phone. Once you have a blue dot that tells you where your current location is, you can pinch to zoom. So Neo Fairies is really our first project of this kind, but for these new building blocks of the blockchain and NFTs and DAOs. The long-term aspiration for Neo Fairies is very much to be a iconic franchise that spans games and film and fashion and has real community involvement and ownership in the entire journey of getting to that long-term outcome. In the very short term, what we're doing now is just planting a seed about what this franchise could be, the core of the IP, attracting the earliest community members who want to be part of where that franchise could go. And all the interesting stuff is really the medium term, right? So what happens between now and that long-term aspiration. And so for us, the thing that's a bit different than typical projects is we are very much in a co-creative mode where we're trying to build out this world, and we're building it in the open with consumers who are excited to be creative and don't need to be artists, but have the motivation to actually populate the Neo Fairies world that we're creating. I'll explain in a second what that means, but that creative phase is really important to understand, because in a traditional context, what you would do as a company or as a studio is you'd go build this world out yourself. You build the content, you create the stories, you create the interactive experiences, and then you just hand them to your community when you're done. What we're trying to do is actually build a project, but also a process where the community is part of filling out this world with us, and therefore also owners and gaining from the future potential for what this could be, and also having a say in what those future directions are. But that means that we're in a mode where there's not quite a product yet, right? There's a core concept, there's a world to be filled in, and there's a set of content to be created that then becomes a jump off point for future products. Okay, so now let's talk about what exactly we actually are doing. Neo Fairies, we talk about as a fantasy punk shared world. It's very much about creating a framework in some ways in terms of fiction and lore that allow people to come in and kind of fill in details, but not necessarily have to make up the entire project from scratch. And the same thing goes for tools we're going to provide. So we'll actually give people ways to contribute locations, characters, stories into the world of Neo Fairies, and to do that in a way that's really accessible and playful and fun and doesn't require deep amounts of creative expertise, but is, enough open-ended enough that people can run with their imagination and don't feel boxed in. I mean, that's kind of the balance we're trying to strike with this. Neo Fairies itself is a fiction about fairies in the world, about them being real, about them being all around us everywhere, but they've just been in hiding. And the backstory is that humans persecuted fairies and chased them into hiding. But we've got this new generation of fairies, like often happens with new generations, that's tired of tradition, that's done hiding. They're going to be out in our world, and they're going to return. And when they do, it's on us as humanity to actually welcome them back and to help see them and tell their stories and share their stories with others. And that kind of framework is the framework in which we start by giving people the ability to set locations where these fairies are going to be sighted. They have tools to create fairies, where these fairy characters are essentially added cast members and build out the world of all the fairies in the Neo Fairies shared world. And then we'll have a way for people to add richer stories and tell these stories about the fairies that they're seeing and sighting different locations. And so at every one of these steps, whether you're creating a location and a setting, you're creating a character, it's a fairy, you're telling a story and creating a sighting. These are all steps in world building. They're all steps in which users have one-of-one NFTs that are created and minted. And each of those contributions to the shared world that's Neo Fairies makes them a member of a DAO. And the Neo Fairies DAO is obviously essential to shaping the future of where the franchise goes. Hi, this is Vijay Sundaram, co-founder and CEO at Luda. If my conversation with the GRTIQ podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
GRTIQ podcast.
Thanks for listening.
So you're talking in terms of franchise, Neo Fairies is just one. It's almost like the initial franchise within this ecosystem, but fully evolved. There's many franchises and lots of different ways for people to get involved. Is that right?
Yes. In a way, we think about, like we talked about with Luda and with Wonder, think about the entire shift that's ahead of us, right? Over the course of, decades, and getting content and entertainment to really be not just user generated, but also user owned. And that does require, in our mind, thinking about new kinds of content from scratch in this way, where people can actually be part of creating and owning and filling out and building and extending these worlds in different directions. So Neo Fairies very much is one very small step in that direction. What we aspire to do is kind of catalyze an entire wave of these, and you're already seeing other people start to think and work on these things, which is exciting. And so for Luda as a creator, Neo Fairies is one of multiple projects like this. And for Wonder as a protocol, there's kind of no limit to the ambition of how many of these things we hope creators will create and share and build.
Well, Vijay, maybe more than any other guest I've had on the podcast, as this scales, as this ecosystem scales, it seems like there's going to be some challenges, but incredible opportunities. And I'm just curious how you're thinking about an environment where there's billions, for example, of NFTs getting minted and this continues to scale, how you're going to address some of those challenges. Yeah,
it's an excellent question. I can't wait to have these problems, as a company that's pre-launch. But, there's some of this stuff, in fairness, is about the ecosystem we're building on, right? So L1 chains that are scalable and performant and environmentally friendly, L2 chains for Ethereum, services like the Graph that provide indexing and querying at scale in a decentralized way. So a lot of these services and platforms and tools in the ecosystem are going to be fundamental to making the future we want work. And of course, with projects like the Wonder Protocol, we're trying to build out complementary sets of things that need to exist for the particular kind of domain of entertainment and decentralized entertainment.
Well, there's a lot of things going on here. And one of the things that I think most attracts me as someone who's reading about it and speaking with you is the inclusive nature. I mean, I think there's some subtle shifts here. I think there's more inclusivity that maybe we haven't seen in Web3 so far. How would you explain that for listeners?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is actually kind of central to what we're imagining the future of user-owned content looks like and what create to own really means. It's not just about having franchises designed to be owned by community, but you want people to be able to actually come in and create in it and own in it, right? And so if you start to think about it from that lens, and honestly, this is where Web 2 did get a lot right. UGC and these UGC platforms, they're quite different from the way we think about things like 10K PFP projects today, right? In traditional creative communities, people start with a sense of deep intrinsic creative motivation, right? They're not here to speculate or driven by extrinsics, right? People will make something in Minecraft not because it's going to be worth tons of money. Eventually it gets professionalized and you have creators who do learn how to do that. But a lot of the early phase of that is true deep personal motivation to create something and to express yourself and to share that with others. In these UGC platforms, users create content themselves. They're not just buying content that someone else has made and handing them, right? If people are creating their own content in these platforms, there's millions and billions of these things they're going to make, not 10,000 that you limit to. And why would you want to limit your entire user base and community base to 10,000 or 100,000 even? You don't want mint fees, and you're not charging people to create something. They're already doing the work and they're already putting in the effort to make something that they believe in and care about. So you want things to be as low cost or no cost as possible, as opposed to hundreds or thousands of dollars to mint something or to buy something to be able to play. And in the end, you want your economics, if you're going to build economics into these projects, you want the economics to reward creativity, right? You want things to be worth nothing by default, which is fine if people enjoy the experience they're in. But the few things that people make and they invest in that create social and cultural value, you want those things to grow in value so those individual users and their creative works do appreciate. And so that's just a very different mindset from trying to construct exclusivity and wealth and fixate on floor prices and trading. And so all of those things together, I think, make for a very different set of tools and systems that you kind of need to do this, but they also hopefully creates a bit of a different culture and ethos and invites people in to kind of this new world of NFTs and DAOs in a way that's maybe a bit harder for the last 2-3 years.
Well, Vijay, I want to ask then, and you already know that a lot of my listeners follow the Graph and are part of the Graph ecosystem. Can you achieve everything you want to achieve with this vision for the ecosystem you're building without a resource that's able to query or index data held on blockchain?
In short, no. I mean, if you think about the idea behind having these sandbox games and open worlds and story universes is that there's a never-ending expansion and growth to what's there. Now you, as a user, come in to one of these experiences and you want to actually see and enjoy the many things people have created or that you yourself have created. You want to find things that are related to your interests or related to things you've made before. And so now all these basic operations of consuming, in effect, the NFTs and the content that other people have created, browsing, searching, navigating kind of the world of content that's been created by the community you're in. These things all now become these basic operations around indexing, querying, serving that are now operating over, millions, if not billions of uniquely owned artifacts as NFTs and tokens on chain.
One of the things that most intrigued me about interviewing you and sharing the story of Luda and what you're building there is this is a very tangible artifact of what Web3 and crypto makes possible. I mean, do you see it the same way? Could Luda and Neo Fairies exist outside of a Web3 environment?
We don't think so. I think it's a big part of the inspiration for Neo Fairies at all, which is the virtue of creating Neo Fairies from scratch for us as a creative team was that we could actually design the IP, the franchise, the fiction, the story world, the tools around the core premise that people would be at the center of creating that world and owning that world, and helping build something much larger than if we had just built it on our own and then just shipped it to people, or took an existing franchise and just bolted NFTs and DAOs onto them. And so that was very much the aspiration for what we're doing. And we're hoping to motivate more and more projects like this, whether they use, our ecosystem or others, because it just feels like a whole new wave of projects like this could actually be not just a way to transform entertainment and give people ownership, but also bring people into this world.
I want to ask you just a couple follow-up questions about how you've projected out about two things that I'm interested or curious about. The first one is Luda has already contributed Neo Fairies. It's already kind of a canvas where creators can start getting involved and participating as you've described. But it's just one, franchise of hopefully endless amounts that creators can get involved in. So my question is, how have you and the team thought through the seeding of the next, quote unquote, Neo Fairies that'll emerge in this ecosystem? What do those early days look like? Is that one creator posting on Discord and then people coalescing around it and building? And then the second question is, do these things in your mind exist forever? Do they never come to an end? Or at some point, the story, as an example of Neo Fairies, get told and closed, and it's time to do Neo Fairies Part 2? How have you thought through those two things?
So let me answer the second question first. It's absolutely meant to be open-ended and never-ending and infinitely moddable, extendable. That is in part going to require the original creators' work to do. I mean, this is, I think, an important part of where the world's going, where whether you're a DAO or your entertainment project, leadership matters. You want the creator who is involved to really be part of shepherding and nurturing the community and the project. But the beautiful thing is that a community that really has ownership at the core of it and that has this notion of creative contribution doesn't hit walls, doesn't hit limits on when things stop. There's no end to creating another structure in Minecraft or creating another game in Roblox. And so the right concept seeded the right way should really provide for that kind of open-ended canvas. And that's the aspiration for, the kinds of projects that exist here. In terms of what is it like for, future creators to make things like this, and even how we approach it as Luda, it's a little too early to tell. And part of what we're even learning now is how do these things really work? We've seen a lot of experiments in the marketplace where people launch an NFT project and they have the kind of core of a character set or a world and a fiction. They launch and sell NFTs, and then they start to build behind that. You see other people in this ecosystem that launch products that are fully formed or at least functional enough that then they can include ways to use NFTs in those products. we're a bit in between in that we're not trying to launch and sell NFTs, nor are we yet at a place where we have product because we want the community involved to build with us. But it's possible. So with Neo Fairies, we are very early and we kind of have this creative phase that I mentioned to you where we're going to bring people in that are consumers, but that want to create settings and characters and stories. It could be, depending on what project you're thinking about as a creator, you need to take it further and you need to build out a bit more of the first experience before you can start to really activate community and get people excited. But then maybe some other people and some other creators have enough powered vision and direction for what they're trying to do. And actually just starting a Discord with high concept is enough to get people in. I think part of the diversity of how these things even start and how you bring community in is some of the magic about the world we're moving into. There's no template for that.
And so for listeners that want to get involved and start interacting with the ecosystem, what's the best thing they can do next?
If you're excited about Neo Fairies as a decentralized franchise and you want to help be part of it, you should come join the Neo Fairies DAO. To join the DAO, the very first thing we're going to have people do is contribute safe places to the Neo Fairies world to make it safe for fairies to return. We'll be sharing more about that in our online channels like our website and Twitter and Discord.
Vijay, I really appreciate, the thoughtful answers and especially this incredible project and what you've shared with listeners today. It's so emblematic of what Web3 can do. And what intrigues me is a word that's often used is disruption, right? And on this podcast, I've had people on that have talked about how Web3 and crypto will disrupt healthcare, how it'll disrupt organizational structures through DAOs, of course, and a host of other themes that have kind of popped up. But this is the first one where someone's come on and clearly articulated a vision for how Web3 will disrupt the entertainment industry. So I guess I want to just give an opportunity to you to clearly articulate that. Is what you're working on, is the vision for what you're doing going to disrupt traditional media and entertainment?
Oof. Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm always a little nervous to talk disruption as a term because it's a high aspiration, but it does feel like there's a very big transformation in store for how we think about entertainment and we think about the role of people. And in this case, it's the individual creators, the players, the fans in not just enjoying entertainment, but actually creating and owning and having a voice in where those things go. Some parts of that are probably not too difficult as a transition for existing entertainment projects and companies. And some parts are pretty stark in their shift, right? Things like open sourcing your creative development process and actually inviting people in very early on before you're even fully sure what it is so they could be part of it. That's scary. In some cases, it might be inadvisable, but it's also possible that that's what creates the strongest foundations for the properties that endure in the future.
Vijay, question I repeatedly ask on the podcast, and there's a bunch of them that I typically go back to just because there's so much perspective and shaping of the conversation right now as it relates to crypto, blockchain, Web3, that different people with different ideas, I think, are really important as we craft this moving forward. And so the question I want to ask is, do you think that Web3 is an inevitability, or do you kind of see it as an experiment where we're kind of building and waiting to see what happens?
Oh, I love that question. Well, yeah, I don't want to get too cute with the answer, but some of this is, what exactly is Web3? And I think the way I look at it is we're all imagining how we aspire to change the world, and Web3 is kind of being shaped to do that. And so I think it's a little more interesting to almost talk about what does that change, that I think has probably galvanized people in this ecosystem. At least for me, it's very much about putting more power back into people's hands, socially, creatively, economically, like we talked about. Can we get to 100% decentralization? I don't know. But even if there's a bit more ownership and empowerment in people's hands and we don't get to 100%, there's still enough to make a dent. And so in that sense, is that future we want inevitability? I think yes. Do the building blocks we have today, literally like in their current form or in some variation or some new one come around? That's, I think, an experiment for sure. And some of those experiments are further along than others. The other thing that's really interesting to me about this ecosystem that I talk about with others is part of what's happening with Web3 or what we consider Web3 is a technology and economics shift. And that is, I think, where there is a lot of experimentation happening about, different types of business models and tokenomics and different technical primitives. But then a big part of this shift that I've observed is also philosophical and cultural. And the philosophical and cultural pieces to me also, again, feel like a bit inevitable, even if the technological and the economic primitives are experimental. And it's because you're seeing people who are simply bringing a different value system to projects that don't depend on technology or economics, right? If you look at a project like Ethereum, where such a tiny fraction of the Ethereum token base went to the early founders, that's not a technology or economics decision. That's simply a philosophical and values-based decision. And more and more projects, I think, that take the mindset of publicly owned protocols and public goods and think about the community as a way to grow the pie so that even if they take a smaller portion than they might have if they were a company, they now actually have a much larger community, a much better off community. So I think that aspect to Web3 is also very special, enduring quality to its ethos, which is hard to see a lot of times in a lot of the day-to-day noise that we're in. And so I'd also make that separation between what aspects of experiment we're running here really are subject to change. Maybe the technology economic side of it does, but the philosophical, cultural kind of roots to a lot of this stuff to me feel really powerful.
So the final question that I want to ask you is kind of coming full circle. You talked about early on when you were providing your professional background, you kind of stepped in big enterprise, you've stepped out as an entrepreneur and done your own thing. And you said this second journey, leaving Google, back out on your own, forming Luda, was a lot about finding your purpose. And a lot of this seems to come back to this idea of play and experiencing the magic of play. And so my final question is, why is that so important for you and for the world?
Okay, so there's two sides to this. One is me personally, and selfishly, finding purpose for me has also been looking at what are the unique ways I can make my dent, right? And so for me, play in particular is something that's deeply ingrained in me. It's something I have a deep amount of respect for and appreciation for. And it's the thing I enjoy bringing to others. And so for me, a big aha was that play is important. And it's more important than people tend to think. It's definitely a lot more important than I think Silicon Valley and traditional technology industry appreciates. And then connecting that back to this thing that has been something that I appreciate about Silicon Valley and technology, which is changing the world. And so for me, connecting the dots of bringing play into this equation for how we help people and to make a dent in the world has been really important. From a why is it important to the world, it is such a powerful motivator. The more you think about play and how fundamental or elemental it is to us as humans, yet how often it's just kind of hammered out of us and leaves us as soon as we stop being kids. The idea that we can harness that, and a lot of different projects and industries have figured out how to harness play very effectively, but to now harness that same kind of human motivation and to deliver those moments of kind of joy and wonder to people, but actually do it in a way that also leaves them better off in different ways and leaves the planet better off for it. That combination has really captured me.
Well, Vijay, now we've reached the point in the podcast where I'm going to ask you the GRT IQ 10. These are 10 questions I ask each guest of the podcast every week to help listeners try something new, learn something different, or achieve more. So, Vijay, are you ready for the GRT IQ 10?
Yeah, let's do it.
The GRT IQ 10.
This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
What book or articles had the most impact on your life?
Wonderland by Steven Johnson.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you think every human should watch?
Twilight Zone.
What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
Nurture optimism.
If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
Nature sounds. I'm an ASMR guy.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people know yet?
Play is purposeful.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
Jump into the ocean. It's actually one of the few ways to be present and disconnect.
Based on your own experiences and observations, What's the one habit or characteristic that you think best explains people finding success in life?
Love to learn.
And the following 3 questions, Vijay, are complete the sentence type questions. The first one is, the thing that most excites me about Web3 is...
It's ethos.
And the second one, if you're on Twitter, then you should be following...
People you don't want to follow.
And the last question, complete the sentence, I'm happiest when...
Making friends and family or myself laugh.
The GRT IQ 10.
After this, I show you how deep the rabbit hole.
Vijay Sundaram, I really appreciate your time. You've been very generous, and I'm really excited about what you and the team are working on. I'll definitely be watching it and cheering for your success. If listeners want to follow you or learn more about what you're working on, what's the best way to stay in touch?
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. I'm at Vijay S. Sundaram on Twitter. And you can also email me at vijay@ludaprojects.com.
This has been a production of the GRT IQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRT IQ
Podcast.